Thibault, Defensive Player of the Year. Is Harden's status as a former, in parentheticals, superstar hurting Embiid's MVP chances, assuming this season he can adequately replicate his success in Brooklyn? He then said, I'm very interested to see what you have to say about this, given what you said on the last podcast when you gave out the Sixers grades. Spoiler alert, I gave them an A, and so did Grant. Here's my thing. If Harden is actually worse, I think it only helps Joel Embiid's MVP chances because he's going to be viewed as someone who doesn't have to carry Harden, but uplift the roster more than you would expect with another star. And I do think there's the issue of cannibalization when we get here, where it's just like, it's harder for, when Golden State right now, it's not harder for Steph to be in the MVP discussion because he's no longer playing with Kevin Durant. Luka's on his own. But like, if you're Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving playing a full season together, if you're Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, LeBron James and Anthony Davis, separating yourself gets harder. Giannis is different because the two stars below him are just not on the same plane. And so when you're dealing with stars that are equals, or at least like, let's just say two top 20 players, which I think at some point, Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton, I don't know if it was at the same time. I probably might have both had them in that area, but they're not consensus. When you're talking about Paul George and Kawhi, Kyrie and KD, like at their peaks, they're all consensus top 20, LeBron, AD, consensus top 10. Although I don't know if AD is a top 10 player anymore. Talk about some tough questions to ask. But do I think like the fact that Harden, I still think is going to be really good, and just looking at some of the moments of bursts he had, I know it wasn't constant in Philly. Let's give the dude an offseason where he's not changing teams, where he's actually happy with his situation. He's with Daryl Morey again, has PJ Tucker, Daniel House there. He seems to like playing with Joel Embiid. His workload is just, it's arguably lighter than it's ever been now too, because you have Embiid. And like, you went from Houston where, yeah, like Chris Paul, I think was most helpful to him, and he adapted his game a lot for Russ, but then you go to, like, you were still the guy, and you still had this absurdly high usage rate, and were tasked with doing so much. And we know that Chris Paul, was injured at the 2018 playoff run, I think it was, like, or just had like the hamstring stuff going around for them. And then Russ was just imperfect for a huge part of the season. They had to change the makeup of their roster. You go to Brooklyn, where like injuries plague you during that 3/4 season, whatever you're there. You yourself, but then just also Kyrie and KD as well, you're banged up. This past season, Kyrie's not available. Kevin Durant gets banged up. You seem like you were visibly banged up / you quit on the team. So now let's put you in Philly. Yes, Joel Embiid, iffy, spotty health as well. But like, if you're healthier and this is like the spot that you now actually want to be in, he might be the best player on the team. Like, that's not, I just want to make it clear. Like, I think that the conversation about Harden being this former superstar has gone too far off the rails. If he's really not, reports are that he's in great shape. Yeah, it's all this offseason shit. Gained 10 pounds of muscle, but still single-digit body fat. Had the perfect offseason. If he's still like not taking care of his body now that he's on the wrong side of 30, yeah, I get the concern. But like this isn't someone who went from an MVP candidate when he was with Brooklyn that first season. Like, when he finished that season, he kind of worked himself into the outskirts of that conversation. Like, these drop-offs, they're not that steep when there's no like real underlying cause and like a serious injury. And if his hamstring is just fucked, okay. But I really think I would bet on Harden winning MVP before Embiid this season. And mostly because the odds plus 7,000, like that's something I think. Don't take this advice, but like, you invest in that and then you sell it back to the sports book because they're worried about that hitting, and you take a smaller profit. That's where I'm at with that. So but if, to the point of this question, assuming Harden is what he was in Brooklyn that first season he was there, yes, it's harder for Joel Embiid to win MVP, because I do think that there's overlap in voters, and we've seen it with Jokic. And this is part of why Jokic was my MVP. Like, I view uplifting a roster that doesn't have a star, a fellow star with you, to being a fringe contender is actually harder than uplifting a team with another top 5, top 10 NBA player to contender status. Now, maybe some people disagree, and depending on the season that Joel Embiid is having, or vice versa, that could change. But if Harden is the player that he was when he was healthy in Brooklyn, not this past season, but 2020, 2021, it's Harden who's going to be more in the MVP conversation than Embiid, in my opinion. And I think a lot of that's just going to have to be with the agency, the control that Harden has over the offense in those situations where, they'll be like, you'll run the offense through both of them and you'll stagger their minutes some, but he's going to be the one that I think is like, I'm not thinking, like, we just know the ball is going to be in his hands first when you're getting into crunch time. Maybe you still run stuff through Embiid. And again, we saw Harden, I think, adapt more than people will credit him for when he had Russ with the Rockets. Like, he's still going to be the go-to option unless he's completely cooked. And so if you're telling me that James Harden is still a superstar, the superstar that he was when Brooklyn first got him, then yes, I think it definitely hurts Joel Embiid's MVP chances without question. And look, that was part of the appeal for Embiid the past 2 years. It's just, yeah, the Sixers were really good, but last season it was because Ben Simmons wasn't there and Tyrese Maxey was your second best player. And then just even with in 2020, 2021, Jimmy Butler had left. Like Ben Simmons he had like some really good moments through that stretch of the year. But Joel Embiid he had to lead this like heliocentric existence. And for the most part, and just the fact that he did more and there weren't limitations ascribed to his game, and he didn't have a teammate who was in the same vein where his second best teammate was considered flawed in Ben Simmons. Like, that's going to help you too. And so I'm trying to think of like another example where like it would be like Trae Young. Like, it was kind of on that, like, because the gap between Trae Young and John Collins is probably about the same between Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. We're talking about that season. Maybe that's a terrible example. But you're not close to, when it's not like a co-equal, Devin Booker and Chris Paul and Phoenix. And there's also, I think, a certain caliber of player you need to be that voters are just going to eschew, but that's a different story altogether. So I would argue I'm investing in Harden's MVP odds because I'm a risk taker at this stuff. I consider myself risk averse in life. Although I am doing something at the moment that is probably just actually fucking stupid, but that's delirious right now. Please just ignore that. So I'm risk averse in general in life, but like when it comes to this stuff, I'm starting to trust my instincts a little bit more or take more chances when I'm making predictions. If I actually believe, I'm not going to just, subscribe to groupthink or the general consensus if I really don't believe it. I just feel like this could be a bounce back year for Harden because of how far perception has shifted. And that almost helps his MVP chances because the baseline or his floor has been set so low. And we're just assuming, not we, but people are just assuming he's hit that floor. So, but to answer your question, Thibault DPOY, I know that I went on this long rant. I do think that Harden's status, if he's actually, worse than he was during that time in Brooklyn, like if he is not the best, if Embiid is the best player on the Sixers by a minor margin, it's a problem for his MVP chances. If the gap is actually wider, like it was, for most of James Harden's time in Philly this past year, if that's the Harden you get all season, Embiid is going to be right in the thick of the MVP discussion. But if Harden is what he was with the Nets, I would just argue not only does it hurt Joel Embiid's MVP case, but Harden might have a stronger one than him at that point.